Well, this is the CBF podcast conversation. Each week, we're bringing you stories from across the world of people doing groundbreaking work and innovative work in renewing God's world. Ideas, stories, and creativity from practitioners, ministers, thinkers, authors, and more. I'm Andy Hale, CBF's podcast host. And this week, we have a special Facebook and YouTube Live interview about how QAnon and Christian nationalism are affecting the church. In a few moments, I'll introduce our guest and we'll jump into the conversation. But we do want to let you know that you have the opportunity to present questions to our guest. If you will comment to the right, if you're on Facebook with your questions, or if you're on YouTube down below. We need to also tell you about one of our annual sponsors, BSK, the Baptist Seminary of Kentucky, is hosting its annual Henson Lectures on Monday, March the 1st from 10:30 a.m. to 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. The E. Glenn Henson Lecture Series started in 2009 and honors the life and work of Dr. E. Glenn Henson by inviting lecturers who share his passions for Christian scholarship in and for the life of the church and the world. This year's lectures will be held virtually and will be free, allowing anyone interested to participate in this highly regarded series. This year's speaker is Dr. Doug Weaver, Director of Undergraduate Studies and Professor of Baptist Studies at Baylor University. Dr. Weaver's lectures are titled Holy Spirit Power, Baptist and the Experience of Pentecostalism, and Baptist and Charismatic Expression from Sensationism to Carpet Time. Visit bsk.edu/Henson for more information. Well, for our guest for this special live conversation, we have Dr. Robert P. Jones. He's the CEO and founder of PRRI and a former associate professor of religious studies at Missouri State University. He is the author of The End of White Christian America and White Too Long. Robert, thank you for joining the conversation.
Oh, thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Well, for those that aren't familiar with who you are, which I can't imagine that to be so, with the two books you've put out and the great work, tell us a little bit more about you, and then we'll talk a little bit about PRRI.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm the founder and CEO of PRRI, which stands for Public Religion Research Institute, and we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization conducting research at this intersection of religion, culture, and politics. We're located in Washington, D.C., and we're founded in 2009. So all of our work is nonpartisan, and we're an independent organization that's funded through foundation support and individual donations.
So in this day and age where everything feels partisan, or everyone doesn't believe there's possibility of partisanship, how do y'all ensure that you're nonpartisan in your work?
Yeah, well, I think we work really hard to ask balanced questions. I mean, a lot of our work is public opinion survey work. So we work very hard to ask questions where we don't have our thumb on the scale one way or the other. We're really trying to get a real, as best of an objective read on where American public opinion is. The other thing that we do, I think that's really about accountability, is that we work very hard to be transparent in what we do. So we're actually a founding charter member of a thing called the Transparency Initiative, which was put together by the American Association of Public Opinion Research a few years ago, really to bring best practices into the field of public opinion research. So, for every survey we do, for example, we publish the entire questionnaire, including the full script of like interviewer instructions, how we randomize questions, what order the questions were asked, exactly what the question order or question wording was, all of which, really matters. And then for the vast majority of our data sets, we actually release them into the public domain. So not only can you, check our question wording, but you can check our math. If you want to download the data set and crunch the numbers yourself, we put about $500,000 worth of free public opinion data into the public domain every year.
I know, like every parent says they love all their children equally, knowing maybe my mother's watching this and keeping in mind that, she does have 3 boys and maybe I am her favorite. Of all the studies that you've conducted, of all the polls you've done, maybe what's the most telling? What's your favorite?
Yeah, there's a couple. See, here I am. I'm not going to pick one kid. I'm going to pick a couple. But I think there's 2 that stand out. One is really the one that I really based my most recent book, White Too Long, the legacy of white supremacy in American Christianity. because I tried to take up the very difficult task of how, and our team did, of how to measure attitudes about systemic racism in the country, which is a pretty difficult thing to get at. Kind of gratified to say, I think we worked very hard looking at the literature, and we're able to kind of put together a set of questions that give us some purchase on, what people's attitudes are around systemic racism in the country. That became the basis of the book, and kind of allowed me to put a contemporary lens on the history of kind of white supremacy in the country. The other one, I think that we're actually in the process of redoing, is a survey we did back in 2013, where we looked at people's social relationships, like their closest friendship networks, and we were trying to figure out how diverse they were, right? So what kind of bubbles are we still living in? And there we found some really telling data that still gets cited today, even though that survey was done in 2013. For example, that we found that for the average white person, their close friendship networks were more than 90% white, and that 75% of white Americans had no person of color of any kind in their kind of close friendship networks. And that kind of goes a long way to explain, I think, how divided we still are. It also held true for partisanship and religion, right? That Republicans tend to be close friends with Republicans, Democrats tend to be close friends with Democrats, and even Protestant Catholics. Protestants still tend to be more kind of close friends with Protestants, and Catholics with Catholics. So, but race, religion, and partisanship, the three things that I think divide Americans the most, are also driving us into these bubbles today.
So I'll pick out one of those favorite, and then we'll spread rumors among your staff. So for those that want to get to know your work a little bit more, we do want to note that we had Robert on the podcast in the fall, and he was gracious enough to come back on. So you can find more about the program that he runs and his good work there, and especially some of his books. But we're here today to talk about two major influencers within the church, QAnon and Christian nationalism. And to get us to an in-depth conversation about the effects of QAnon and Christian nationalism and how they're having within the church, I think it would be helpful to build a framework as to how you would define these terms. So let's start with the easier one, Christian nationalism.
Yeah, terms are interesting things for what they bring into view and what they hide. I'm not a big fan of Christian nationalism as a term by itself, because I think the phenomenon that we're really talking about is white Christian nationalism. So I always want to add another adjective to that term. I think it's a helpful term as long as we really remember that what the real challenge that we're facing is really about white Christian nationalism, or the way that Christian nationalism is operationalized inside of white Christian spaces. So I think that's the main thing. And the reason that's important is because I think at the bottom of it, and I think the term that we often, when we're talking in white spaces or white Christian spaces, the term that is harder to talk about is white supremacy. And I think that is like such an important thing not to dodge when we're talking about these phenomenon, because at the end of the day, the root thing that we're talking about is, and Christian nationalism gets at this in some ways, like a kind of ownership of the country. But if we really want to get to the most powerful form of that, it really has been wrapped up with white supremacy. That is the idea that the country was divinely ordained to be a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant country. Like, that's the purest form of the problem as it has manifested itself in our history. So I would say, like, the roots of it are in this idea that white Anglo-Saxon Protestants in particular are really designed to be the primary beneficiaries of the United States and of kind of this kind of cultural concept we talk about when we say America.
And for many, their interaction with QAnon or Q has been, brief news reports or SNL sketch or even opening monologues from late night host. To the best of your abilities, what is it?
Right. Well, this is one of the challenges. It's a very fuzzy thing. But there's an anonymous poster person posting on these chat boards, 4chan primarily, who calls himself Q, and kind of puts out these prophecies, predictions, kind of secretive messages, and so it is kind of taken on a life of its own, particularly during the last year around the election. But what's notable about it, we're on we're in a conversation in a kind of evangelical Christian space here, and what's notable about it, though, I think, and really where it gets its power, is that it borrows from Christian tropes. So it talks about a battle between good and evil, like an ultimate battle between good and evil, where the stakes are really high, right? Well, the stakes could not be higher. It really is about the triumph of good versus evil, a very black and white view of things, and sort of, and then kind of lays that onto our kind of political structures, and it talks about things like a great messianic figure, right, which should feel very familiar to Christians, that's going to ultimately come and depose the people who are in power, and kind of bring in the kingdom and bring in a new order, and that the work is to kind of usher in that order. So, I mean, for anyone studying Christian apocalyptic movements or messianic trends, in even in Judaism, I mean, these things are not new, right? They're borrowing some very old themes, but they have been kind of melded onto our contemporary political situation in ways that then makes things like storming the Capitol, in the name of Q, and kind of keeping Donald Trump in power as a way to be faithful to God and to kind of fight good versus evil. So it really has made politics, which in a democracy, right, are never designed to be about ultimate good and ultimate evil. That's compromise, right? And our political opponents, in a healthy democracy, are not our enemies, right? They're people we disagree with and people we hope to agree with on another day. But it heightens our politics and kind of transposes them into this realm of good and evil. And I think it's why it's been so corrosive, really, to our democracy and to our churches too, because it does borrow and kind of even blends in biblical prophecy with these kind of other kinds of prophecy.
What should it tell us about the nature of where we are as a society, that people are so willing to trust? Again, the word you used was an anonymous source or anonymous poster online, that we're so willing to trust somebody that we've never seen before, somebody we've never had a personal conversation with, and base so much of our worldview off of these things that are being stated or prophesied.
Yeah, I mean, I think it says that we're in a pretty unhealthy place as a country, and as a Christian, it's Christian churches as well that have been so ineffective at kind of stamping this down. I would say that I think, again, to get to the root of it, part of what's happening, I think, is the country's going through a great amount of demographic change. I wrote about that in my sort of previous book, The End of White Christian America, that we've crossed this boundary just in the last decade. So it's very new, really, of being a majority white Christian country to one that is no longer a majority white Christian country. And I think crossing that threshold has caused a great deal of anxiety among white Christians, right? Who I think really did believe that the country was designed for them and that they were to be the beneficiaries of the country. And as the country has changed and shifted, not only in its demographics, but in its values, I think that has caused a great deal of vertigo, like kind of cultural vertigo, and that creates an opening for this. And I think in many ways, this last year was something of a perfect storm. So what are the things that anchor people to reality? Right. Often it's community, right? And so it's being in community with people. And I think the pandemic this past year has so isolated all of us, right? And so rather than being, in conversation with people that we know and trust, we're spending more time online. We're trolling, Facebook, kind of doom scrolling Facebook and Twitter and on these kind of message boards, because we're all kind of holed up in our houses with, and bored. And so I think it has kind of done that. I think the other thing to say that has really paved the way here was particularly Trump's attack on the media over the last 4 years, right? And the whole idea of fake news and this idea that you can't trust what we're getting, even from our best media sources, from the broadcast sources to CNN, to, for the New York Times, the Washington Post, that no matter where it's coming from, even our local news, that we can't trust it. And this idea that there's a conspiracy behind that to keep us in the dark about something is kind of easy to believe when the world seems upside down because of the pandemic, and when we're isolated. And then when we have a leader of the country who is constantly talking about the media, who is supposed to be a kind of vanguard of trust in a democracy, right? They're the people who tell us kind of what's going on in a way that we can kind of hold our political leaders accountable. But when that gets undermined, it leaves this vacuum, right? And then I think into that vacuum, something like, oh, well, let me tell you what's really going on, and that there's another source that can tell you you're being duped by all of these folks. But when we have that coming from the highest office in the land, it is really something to be taken quite seriously. And I think that also kind of provided this opening for another kinds of thing. And whenever I think in history we've had these kinds of apocalyptic movements or even conspiratorial moments, they often are in times of social and cultural distress, right? And I do think that the environment that we've been in is one that has been ripe for this, kind of helped along by a president who was undermining the media, talking about fake news. And then I think in the context of a country that was changing quite dramatically and quite quickly all around us, and where white Christians found themselves less in the center and being kind of moved from being kind of the dominant force to kind of one force among many in the country.
So, at first glance, to what could be argued a level-headed person, the concept and theories of Q are just comedic at the most innocent and psychologically unstable at the worst. Okay, it could be much worse than that. But your research has found just how serious the influence of Q is on the American religious landscape. Why is that the case?
Yeah, I think it is, well, a couple things. I mean, I'll make this really concrete. I mean, not a few miles from my house is the pizza restaurant that an armed gunman showed up at and fired shots in because he was following instructions from Q and was convinced that there was a pedophile ring being run out of the basement of this restaurant. Right? I mean, there's absolutely no basis in fact whatsoever, but someone acted on it, brought a gun to the restaurant, fired a shot off, and luckily no one was killed, but terrorized the people who were there. In Christian circles, I was on with someone else just earlier this week talking about this, and they were not a religious person, and they basically said this. They said, well, look, if your worldview is based on believing in something invisible, what else are you susceptible to believe in? But I think that's actually too easy a shot here. I think it's more, what's really at stake is something more troublesome than that. It's not quite so simple as that. I mean, I think particularly in white Christian circles, one of the challenges that we're facing is white Christians are being asked to let go of this concept of ownership of the country, right? As the country's changing, the country's gone from being 54%, white and Christian, only 44% white and Christian today, just since 2008. So that's been a fairly quick movement. White evangelicals alone have gone from being 21% to 15% of the country during that same period. So there's this sense of loss, the sense of shift in the country. And what I would say is that part of the appeal here has been, when you're faced with that kind of change, if the bedrock of your worldview has been, again, this thing about that America is designed to be and divinely ordained to be a white Christian country, or a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant country specifically, and you see that falling away all around you, you kind of have two choices. I mean, you can face the facts and kind of take in those changes, and that's going to mean rethinking this fundamental worldview, or you can start looking in some kind of and really in some desperation. I think that's kind of a key word here, that conspiracy theories tend to kind of have credibility at moments of crisis, and when people are in some desperation looking for explanations of things that bewilder them. And so I think that's part of what's happening here, that if you don't face the facts, then you are susceptible, I think, to spinning out all kinds of theories that are in some way are going to confirm this other worldview, that no, actually the country is a white Christian country, should still be a white Christian country. And because what we found, and all the research is out there, really confirms that these things go hand in hand. The QAnon conspiracy theory goes hand in hand with a kind of white Christian nationalism, and goes hand in hand with anti-Semitism. Like, these things are all wrapped together, right, as a worldview. And so it really is about protecting a kind of white Christian ownership of the country, and finding ways to explain it, even when all the evidence around you, and maybe especially when all the evidence around you seems to be telling you, no, actually the country looks quite different than that today, and is going to look quite different than that for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, we'll get to into a little bit of some questions about the eerie similarities between this and Nazi Germany, which not a lot of people want to talk about. That seems very harsh, but they really do. You're a historian. We'll get to that here in just a little bit. Our news outlets are a microcosm of the duality of realities by which Americans live. And while many, based on your research, feel like things are going in a positive direction, 58% of Americans polled in 2017, there are many that don't believe that to be true. And you recently wrote stating white evangelical Protestants, 43%, Hispanic Protestants, 45%, and other Christians, 47%, are the only religious groups among whom a majority does not say that American culture has mostly changed for the better since the 1950s. How does the philosophy of Q play into the disparaging perspectives of America's direction among white evangelicals?
Yeah, I mean, I think it often is cast with a sort of nostalgic tone, right? It's a retake the country, reclaim a past, and again, in some ways, it's where things made sense, right? Where, from a white Christian perspective, things made sense. So I think that's kind of all wrapped up in exactly what you're talking about. This, and it's no coincidence that, for example, Trump's slogan had this nostalgic ring to it, right? Make America great again. And I also think it's notable that in the campaign, it kind of went by very fast, but the official campaign slogan for 2020 for the Trump campaign was supposed to be "Keep America Great." And he very quickly found that wasn't resonating. Like, that wasn't what people felt. What people felt was that original slogan, which was "Make America Great Again," because it was a hearkening back to this kind of 1950s America. And, we should just be very explicit about what that means. I mean, that's pre-civil rights era. It's back to a kind of very gender kind of hierarchy, men working outside the home, women being homemakers and having kids at home. Where there were whites only neighborhoods and whites only sanctuaries were the norm among many white churches. So I think it is a kind of hearkening back to this kind of hierarchical worldview where whites were over non-whites, men were over women, and there was a kind of order to it, right? And so this kind of chaos versus order contrast is something you'll hear a lot in those kind of QAnon thing. You're fighting to kind of restore, reclaim. It's a kind of going back and bringing the country back to a former time where it made sense.
Yeah, Keep America Great was also, a line from the Purge movie series. So I think that might have also been a reason why it was taken down as well. We want to remind our audience that you can offer some questions that we'll get to in just a little bit. But now would be the time to start contributing those questions so we can process them and be able to ask those later on. We do need to pause to tell you about one of our other annual sponsors, the Center for Congregational Health, whose mission is to help faith communities and their leaders thrive. Healthy congregations can transform their communities to be more compassionate, faithful, and just. Utilizing a network of highly skilled coaches and consultants and intentional interim ministers, the center supports congregations and ministry leaders to address the challenges they face. Visit their website, healthychurch.org, to learn more about the center and as a trusted partner in ministry. Okay, we've all seen it before. The patriotic services around July 4th, Memorial Day weekend, and Veterans Day. Some a bit more brazen than others when it comes to shooting spangled fireworks and flag displays on their stages. And still, for many churches, there still remains that American flag in the sanctuary just inches taller than the Christian flag. For many, their concept of Christian nationalism, which almost feels like a patriotic duty, but it goes much deeper than just those examples. Christian nationalism was on full display at January's coup attempt at the Capitol. Jesus 2020 flags accompanied with Christian flags, shofars, along with gallows and zip ties and assault weapons were present. These seem like extreme examples for many, but how does this take root at the local level in the church based on your research?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think it's exactly right. I wrote a piece for Religion News Service on January 7th, the day after the riots at the Capitol. And the title was Taking the White Christian Nationalist Symbols at the Capitol Seriously. Right. I think so I don't want to move too quickly past these were extremist examples, because in fact, I think we ought to take them quite seriously, that they were there. There were, in addition, to really awful anti-Semitic tropes, like someone wearing a Camp Auschwitz sweatshirt, or 6 million Jews were not enough, kind of abbreviations on their clothing. There were also, numerous very large Confederate flags, right, that people saw marching through the Capitol. In fact, the insurrectionists at the Capitol accomplished something that the Confederate Army never was able to accomplish, and that is bringing the Confederate battle flag into the U.S. Capitol building. That was the first time that happened in American history. So we should kind of note that too. But alongside of all of that, kind of white supremacy stuff, and is the Christian flag, Bibles, crosses. Even in the evidence presented in the impeachment hearings, this sort of 5-minute video. This video at minute 5 is a gigantic white cross, right, being carried up. And if you look at the other video things, not only was the Confederate flag carried through the breached chamber, but the Christian flag, that one that you described, the white flag, it's a white flag with a blue canton in the upper corner with a red Latin cross in that blue piece of the flag, was also carried along with the Confederate flag into the breach chamber. Now that's the flag that I grew up seeing on the platform, as you said, the kind of American flag on one side, the Christian flag on the other. And if there are people watching who grew up in Southern Baptist life, or as I did during Vacation Bible School, we said the Pledge of Allegiance to the American flag, and right behind that, we said the Pledge of Allegiance to the Christian flag and the Pledge of Allegiance to the Bible, right? And so the fact that these things were carried together as part of this, I think we should take quite seriously the kind of easy juxtaposition of symbols of white supremacy and symbols of Christianity. I mean, those people weren't fighting each other. They were on the same team, right? And taking that quite seriously as we go. And I think we ought to interrogate that. What does it mean, right, to have these two symbols sitting on so many? And they're not just in evangelical churches; they're in many mainline churches as well. In fact, the National Council of Churches has officially adopted that flag the Federal Council of Churches did it in 1942. The National Council of Churches inherited that when they were formed as the official, Christian flag. But how those interplay in our sanctuaries, I think, are really important. Stanley Hauerwas, way back when, was pretty famous for saying, like, the most important thing Christian churches could do to kind of help reform our theology on this front is to remove the American flag from our sanctuaries.
You're a historian, and though books have been written about the decades of development of the merging of patriotism with the Christian faith, but to the best of your ability, can you tell us how we got here? And maybe,
Yeah.
obviously we could have a whole conversation about that, but for those that are trying to kind of wrap their minds around how do we get here?
I mean, honestly, I think that the most honest answer is that what we're seeing is the logical end of the version of Christianity that landed on American shores with the first European settlers. Now, we'd like to tell a story about religious liberty and religious freedom, but I think if we go back a little further and we realize that the real engine, I think the thing that I think most white Christians know very little about, and that every white Christian should know something about, is actually the doctrine of discovery from 1493. That set us, I think, most clearly on this course. It was basically a papal edict that said that if you were a European Christian and you were part of some exploratory effort and you landed on the shores of a distant land where the people who lived there, the indigenous people who lived there, were not Christian, that you had the authority of God and the church to seize those lands and to dominate and control those people in the name of Christianity and the European nation that you were a part of. Now, that's the interior logic of the European versions of Christianity that landed in America, right from the beginning. So the idea of seizing Native American lands, the idea of capturing people from Africa and forcibly bringing them in chains to work as enslaved people in this country, that very logic is brought with Christianity from the get-go here. And so, there's a way of saying, like, it has been there certainly from the beginning of American Christianity that we inherited from Europe. And we've never, I think the troubling thing is, I think we white Christians have never fully dealt with that legacy. It is that deep and that long. And we've just never fully dealt with it. I mean, we kind of move from, so we'll oppose, we kind of move to be mostly opposing slavery, but not opposing white supremacy. We'll move away from segregation, but turn a blind eye to mass incarceration, or even support laws that feed that dynamic. And so I think that we're just due. I think James Baldwin talked about a bill coming due, and that was going to be a very tough bill to pay. And I think that's partially where we are.
Y'all have done some research. PRI's recent survey with the Brookings Institute found that 70% of the country feared that white supremacist groups would be a source of violence following the election. What should these stats tell us about our present and our upcoming future?
Yeah, they're troubling. So partially that tells us that even before January 6th, most Americans saw something like this coming and were worried about it. We also had, you mentioned kind of older surveys, and kind of thinking about my role as a kind of public opinion researcher. There have been moments this last year where, and over the past few years, where I would write a question because we needed to know the answer, and I could not believe, I was in dismay that we needed this question, right? And so one of those questions was, how much do you think that the speech and actions of President Donald Trump have encouraged white supremacist groups? Like, the fact that I would need to write a question like that about a sitting president was just stunning to me. And to come back, and when the answer came back, that a majority of Americans, before the election, a majority of Americans, it was 57%, said that they believe that President Trump's behaviors and actions have encouraged white supremacist groups. And by the time we did a follow-up survey after January 6th, and that number jumped to 62%. But here's the thing: with huge partisan divides, right? That we basically have independents and Democrats believing that's true, and nowhere near a majority of Republicans believing that's true, and nowhere near a majority of white evangelicals, by the way, who strongly supported Trump and gave him about 8 and 10 of their votes in both 2016 and 2020, still largely standing by him. So I think this great gap, right, in how we're seeing reality is deeply troubling, I think, for our future. And I guess the last point I'll say on this is that, the other thing we found is that the two political parties are increasingly moving apart from each other in terms of their composition, their racial and religious composition. Today, we have a Republican Party that's approximately 2/3 white and Christian, and a Democratic Party that's only 1/3 white and Christian, right? So these are two very different views, really. And if we continue down this path, we'll essentially have one party, we'll have a Republican Party that's a white Christian nationalist party. And basically everyone else is going to be over here. And that's a deeply, deeply unhealthy place for a democratic society to be.
Well, I do have to note there was a drastic shift from the 2016 election to 2020 election when it comes to white evangelicals voting for Donald Trump. In 2016, it was 82% of white evangelicals. And then in 2020, it was 81%. So that was a very dramatic shift, shift there.
Yeah. Right.
As I've noted, you're a historian. Maybe you wouldn't classify yourself as a theologian, but as you look at these particular groups that have a proclivity to these things, how does the theology of a certain sect of American Christianity landscape have a proclivity to these types of influencers, with a Christian nationalism or QAnon?
Yeah. Well, I think, white evangelicals in particular have long flirted with, what historically, I'll dust off my, Christian church history here, has been essentially Gnosticism, right? This which was a kind of proclaimed a Christian heresy, back in the day, because it had many of these same features. It was kind of reducing, kind of everyday reality to these great battles between good and evil. It also had an element of secret knowledge that only the innermost circle, right, was privy to. So this sounds a lot like QAnon at the end of the day. So I think back about these things that I'm older than you, so I remember very much these Left Behind novels, right? These were New York Times best-selling books, sold millions and millions of copies. Tim LaHaye, kind of churned these things out for more than a decade. And they were basically picking this up. It was, everyday events were infused with a battle between God and Satan. And you were engaged as a prayer warrior to be on the side of the angels and God against the Satan and demons. And that's the lens through which, kind of common events were seen. Again, I think the danger of this, of course, is that we always see ourselves on the side of God and righteousness. It provides, we're in the middle of, season of Lent. We've just begun Lent. It provides very little space for self-critique, for self-reflection, and for really seeing sin closer to home than over there. And I think that's a deep, deep problem too, is that, so I think even recovering some deep Lenten practices, among Protestants that maybe don't follow the liturgical calendar. I certainly didn't in my Baptist church growing up. But I think recovering space for that and is a way, what could be kind of a way of inoculating ourselves against this too easy conflation with our side as the side of God and righteousness, and that side is the devil and evil. Because in politics, in a democratic society, if we move from seeing people as our political opponents to being the enemies of God, we've deeply undermined any sense of being a democratic republic.
So I can't tell from your answer. Should I keep the series of Tim LaHaye books on my bookshelf above me, or should I not?
You can use them as Exhibit A of answering your question of how we got here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, they're leather bound and signed. I don't know what I'm going to do with them. But for many that grew up in the evangelical tradition, the purpose of the Christian faith, as taught to them, was believe in Jesus and get to heaven. And it's almost, the thought is, I'm saved, so let's just support whatever we want to and ignore the blatant contradiction to Jesus and the ideologies that we endorse. What's your take on what appears to be the disconnect of the teachings and ministry of Jesus to the radicalization of Christian nationalism and QAnon followers?
Yeah, well, we've always had trouble with this. I think if I mean, the white Christian church in this country has made the teachings of Jesus compatible with all kinds of things. I mean, I grew up Southern Baptist. The word Southern, right, in that title is a direct attribution to supporting the Confederacy and supporting. In fact, it was supporting slavery even before there was a Confederacy. So the founding of the Southern Baptist Convention was 1840, or the break was 1845. It's actually the same year that the Methodists split into Northern and Southern factions. And if you go back and you read the sermons from both the Methodists and the Baptists in the South, there's a Jesus there that's very, that not only is compatible with slavery, but demands its existence in the service of a godly vision of what human society should look like. I mean, it is like outwardly praised. So that white Jesus, in 1845, was a Jesus that compelled white Christians to enslave other human beings on the basis of the color of their skin. So I think we got to wrestle with this. It's a little too easy to kind of trot out a phrase like incompatible with the teachings of Jesus. I think we got to kind of take our own history seriously and see how we've warped that understanding. Right? We've kind of invoked a version of Jesus that's perfectly compatible with white supremacy. In fact, we've done that for most of our history. I think that's the thing we really have to swallow. And so if we're going to do something different, if we're going to talk about a Jesus that calls us to something different, there's going to have to be some real work on our Christology, really, and to put it in theological terms, to reconfigure and to reject these other versions, these other interpretations of who Jesus is and what Jesus demands that so easily, sat inside of white Christian circles.
I mean, when you drill into it, it's a very simple thought on my end, which is we don't take Jesus serious. Jesus for many white evangelicals is just a stepping stool to the gateway of eternity. And, the salvific acts of a crucifixion and resurrection are all that matters. And everything that happens before that is just, incompatible with the way we want to live our lives. And that's a hard message that all of us, we can all find all areas of our life in which Jesus' teachings can be incompatible, for sure. Denominationalism in the United States has been on a downward trajectory for decades now. Southern Baptists are the leading declining group. When you look at the incidents like the Capitol coup and the support of Christian nationalism, QAnon, within many mainline white Christian churches. Now, I would say QAnon is not as prevalent. People are a little bit more quiet in their support of these things, but Christian nationalism certainly is a bit more forthright. What kind of effect do you think it's going to have on church decline?
Yeah. Well, I think that we've been in a period, as you said, of decline. I gave you the kind of numbers earlier. And we have seen it kind of stabilize at where we are at about 44% of the country is white and Christian now, 15% of the country is evangelical, and about 15%, by the way, are white mainline. So the mainline and evangelical groups are basically the same size today. The last couple of years has been fairly stable, but the future doesn't look like very stable. If you look, for example, among young people today, and you look at like older Americans and compare those two groups, Americans over the age of 65, about a quarter of that group is white evangelical. But if you look at Americans under the age of 30, that number is 8. Only 8% are white evangelical, right? So just from the oldest Americans to the youngest Americans, white evangelicals have lost 2/3 of their market share, and they've lost it again mostly among these younger cohorts. And I mean, so I think we've got actually a testimony with people kind of voting with their feet, right in front of us. That for many young people, this vision of a church that is wrapped up with ownership of the country, that is complicit at best, and proactive at worst in upholding and sustaining white supremacy, that has staked out pretty harsh positions around gay and lesbian members in their midst in our communities. This is and has really pledged itself to not only to a party, but in these last 4 years, in many ways, to a person. This is not a church that many young people are going to sign up for. I mean, any one of those things, runs pretty far against the values of Americans under the age of 30. H. Richard Niebuhr talked about a kind of internal and external witness to the church. And the internal witness is kind of the stories that the church tells about itself. External witness is stories that the church kind of gets about itself from the world. One of the things I would say is that, young people today have delivered a pretty serious indictment of white Christian churches by leaving, here. And the reasons are complex, but certainly partisanship, kind of a partisan allegiance, anti-science, anti-gay, and kind of in defense of white supremacy. These are all things that kind of smack as inauthentic to young people.
We just got time for one question from our audience, which is, as you indicated earlier, this movement seems to want to return back to the 1950s, which included women being subservient in the household and workplace. So why then are so many women part of this movement? What seems to be the appeal?
Yeah, well, this is, I think, part of the thing that I think had many people scratching their heads in 2016, right? That white women voted for Trump. They didn't vote for Hillary Clinton, right? Even when they had a female presidential candidate in front of them. And what we have found really in the data is that gender tends to be a weaker divider, a weaker supporter on issues like this. That things that basically it's race, party, and religion that really are much more powerful predictors of where people are going to be. So the gender divides are not what you would think when you look at many of these attitudes around white supremacy, Christian nationalism. I mean, they're there with men being more likely to be in that camp, but they're not as big as you might think. So there is a kind of way in which women have been brought into this patriarchal kind of hierarchical and patriarchal worldview. And one quick thing, I think about a great book Kristen Luker wrote back, really about motherhood and the politics of abortion, where she was basically kind of talking about this kind of women's support for a kind of pro-life stance, and that she found that it was really about somewhat about abortion itself, but it was really about conflicting conceptions of motherhood, and that fit, right, a kind of mothers being at home, that kind of role fit in a kind of worldview, and I think for many women, particularly in evangelical circles, that still holds some sway.
Final question for congregational leaders listening or watching. What word of leadership do you give them as they seek to navigate spiritual formation around the challenges of Q and Christian nationalism?
Yeah. Well, again, I would say if you want to get at the root of it, these are symptoms of a deeper cause, right? That of deeper illnesses, and so I think really to aim at the root of it, we really have to aim at white supremacy, and this because underneath Christian nationalism is this idea, that again it's a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant country. QAnon stuff and good and evil is about kind of reclaiming that same kind of vision, and the data does show that again these things are tied together. QAnon is highly predictive of white Christian nationalism and white supremacy, and it's very connected to even anti-Semitism as well, another aspect of white supremacy. So I would say we need to tackle it at the root, and I think the root of this really is this vision that if you're white Christian, particularly if you're Protestant, you have a privileged place in this country, and the country is designed to benefit you, really at the expense of others. So I think I think about things like Christian ideas of it really is about equality, hospitality, and I think if we could kind of go back to, this sounds kind of simplistic, but I keep getting driven back to, if white Christians would commit themselves to just telling the truth and loving our neighbors, as simplistic as that sounds, but it would be revolutionary if we could do that, because it would involve telling the truth about our complicity in white supremacy, and the loving our neighbors part would get us to really doing something about that. And there would be great healing, I think, outside of white Christian circles. But here's what I think is really at stake, and that QAnon really brings to the fore. I'll end with this. What it really brings this to light is a real sickness inside of white Christian churches, and a kind of mental illness, if you will. And I think if we really want to get ourselves back to health, and I'll credit James Baldwin here for really helping me think in these terms. I mean, he talked about white supremacy as inducing a kind of madness among whites, right? Warping our sense of reality. And so to put this in Christian terms, if we want to get into a healthier view of reality, and a healthier view relationship with our African American brothers and sisters, and even a healthier a relationship with God, we really have to tackle the ways in which white supremacy has warped our personalities and warped our ability to see reality, and made us susceptible, I think, to many of these desperate theories that really are about propping up something that we know we should never have had in our grasp, in our hands in the first place.
Well, before we go, we need to let you know about one more of our annual sponsors, McAfee School of Theology at Mercer University, who exists to train ministers who inspire the church and the world to imagine, discover, and create God's future. Located in Atlanta, Georgia, the McAfee School of Theology offers doctoral and master degree programs, including a fully online Master of Divinity degree, the only fully online MDiv offered by a nationally researched university. You can visit their website, theology.mercer.edu, to learn more about their program and scholarship. We also want to let you know about the CBF podcast community that you can join through the CBF podcast listener support page at cbf.net/podcast support. For a few dollars a month, give you the opportunity to receive books from some of the people we have on. You could even join me for an interview, or hopefully if we have General Assembly next summer, to be able to part of that VIP experience with the guests we bring in for the podcast. Well, I want to extend a word of thanks for those watching and adding your great questions, and apologies that we weren't able to get to all of them. If you want to stay connected with Robert, you can follow his work at prri.org or follow him on Twitter. Of course, go out and purchase White Too Long wherever books are sold. Robert, thank you for your continued brilliant work to bring into view the reality of American Christian landscape. And your work is bolstering a catalytic change within many of our churches and demographic movements. So thank you for your good work.
Oh, thank you for those kind words. I'm really happy to be with you.
All right, folks, that's it. That's our conversation. If you want to learn more, you can subscribe to CBF on podcasts on all the major platforms, including iTunes, Spotify, SoundCloud, and Google Podcasts. Don't forget to like and share this episode on your favorite social media platform. Be supportive of our annual sponsors by visiting their websites. Again, that's Baptist Seminary of Kentucky, the Center for Congregational Health, McAfee School of Theology's Doctorate of Ministry program, and check out cbf.net for more information about our church starters, field personnel, advocacy work, and much more.